The researcher had done this 1,000 times before. Measure the height, measure the width, log the ratio, move to the next image in the folder. Tedious work, the kind that eats a graduate student's late nights. By the 300th photograph, his eyes had glazed over. But somewhere around image 250, something started nagging at him. That low hum at the back of the skull, the animal part of the brain flagging a pattern before conscious thought can name it. He kept measuring, kept logging. And when he finally sat back and looked at the column of numbers running down his screen, hundreds of them, drawn from stone carved on 3 separate continents by people who could never have met, separated by thousands of miles of ocean and thousands of years, his hand froze on the mouse. The numbers weren't similar, they were the same. He'd later described the moment to a colleague with a phrase that doesn't belong in the vocabulary of careful science, quietly unsettling. What he'd been measuring was a handbag, a small rectangular bag with a curved handle carried by a divine figure. It shows up again and again in the art of civilizations that had no possible way of knowing each other existed. It's carved into the oldest temple ever found. It's held by winged giants on the walls of Assyrian palaces. It's clutched by gods on the gateway of the sun high in the Bolivian Andes. It's pressed into clay by the Olmec of ancient Mexico. And for most of the last century, every archaeologist who noticed it did the same thing. Glanced at it, wrote decorative motif in their notes, and moved on. This is what happened when a small group of researchers refused to move on. What they found when they treated a piece of decoration like a physical object, measured it, mapped it, tested the comfortable explanation against actual evidence. And what that evidence did to the comfortable explanation was leave it in pieces on the lab floor. Because this bag doesn't behave the way a symbol is supposed to. And once you see why, you understand why some of the people who studied it stopped bringing it up at dinner parties. Start where it starts, in Sumer. We need to be careful here at the outset, because the moment anyone says ancient astronauts or gods from the sky, a certain kind of viewer hits the back button, and a certain kind of writer reaches for the wildest claim available. So let's be clear first. Sumer isn't fringe. It isn't some paperback fantasy from an airport bookshop. Sumer is the mainstream, textbook, undisputed cradle of civilization. The flat, hot floodplain between the Tigris and Euphrates where, roughly 5,000 years ago, people did something never done before. They wrote. They pressed the first true symbols into wet clay, inventing writing itself. They recorded the first laws. They built the first cities with populations in the tens of thousands. They mapped the sky into constellations we still half recognize, split the hour into 60 minutes and the minute into 60 seconds, and worked out celestial mathematics with a precision that still impresses modern astronomers. Nothing about the Sumerians needs embellishment to be impressive. They were the beginning. And it's here, in this earliest flowering of recorded civilization, that the oldest confirmed images of the bag appear. Not as a minor curiosity, but woven directly into depictions of the divine. The figures holding it aren't ordinary farmers or scribes. They're rendered larger than the humans around them, wearing horned helmets. Ancient shorthand for divinity. Some have wings. And in one hand, held down at the side, gripped by that curved handle, is the bag. Always the same size, always the same shape, always carried the same way. You can go see one of these carvings today. The best-known Mesopotamian example is a plaque called the Burney Relief, dated to roughly 1950 BCE, nearly 4,000 years old. It shows a goddess flanked by owls, her feet ending in the talons of a bird of prey, holding objects scholars have debated for a century. But she's not the only figure carrying this posture and these accessories. Trace the surviving art of Mesopotamia further, and the bag keeps turning up. On cylinder seals, the small carved stone tubes, Sumerians rolled across wet clay to sign documents. On the stela of the vultures, one of the oldest war monuments ever found, commemorating a border victory between rival city-states. It's there, and there, and there again. Hold that image in your mind, the goddess on the Burney relief around 1950 BCE, and then jump forward a full 1,000 years. That's roughly the distance between us and the fall of the Byzantine world, the entire medieval period and the modern age laid end to end. In 1,000 years, human culture normally transforms. Past recognition. Languages die and are born. Empires rise and vanish. Clothing, art, tools, gods. Everything shifts and reinvents itself. That's simply what culture does. It doesn't hold still. And yet, on the walls of the palace of Ashurnasirpal II, the Assyrian king whose reign began around 883 BCE, a full millennium after the Burney relief, archaeologists found the giants again, winged, muscular, standing beside a stylized sacred tree, seemingly tending or blessing it. In one hand, many hold a small cone, reaching to touch the tree. In the other, held down at the side, gripped by that same curved handle, is the bag. Not an evolved version, not a descendant shaped by 1,000 years of stylistic drift. The same proportions, the same handle, the same rectangular body, the same manner of carrying, as if a single object had been photographed once in Sumer and photographed again 1,000 years later, untouched by anything in between. This is the detail that should stop you in your tracks, and it stopped the researchers cold too. Human symbols don't behave this way. They can't help but evolve. The cross, the crown, the eagle, the letters on this page. Trace any of them across 3,000 years and you'll watch them warp, split, and multiply into countless variants. But this handbag, across 3 millennia of Mesopotamian art, from the birth of writing to the height of Assyrian power, simply didn't evolve. That kind of stillness isn't how memory normally works. Memory is lossy. Copy is shaped by hand across 100 generations of artisans, each learning from the last, and errors accumulate. A wider handle here, a flattened base there, a flourish added by a showy carver. Over 30 centuries, small drifts compound into something unrecognizable. That's precisely why art can be dated by style. Everything moves, and a trained eye can place a carving within a century because of it. Except this, the handbag behaves less like a symbol being copied and more like a fact being recorded, less like a message passed through generations of retelling, and more like a specification held constant because the object it described never changed. Which raises the obvious next question, the one everyone eventually lands on, standing in a museum gallery beneath these towering reliefs. Who's holding it? Because the figure gripping this bag is never a farmer, a king, or an ordinary worshiper. Look closely, the details are strange but consistent. These figures loom over the humans carved beneath them, a head taller, sometimes 2, rendered at a scale Mesopotamians reserved for beings of a higher order. Many wear horned helmets, tier upon tier of curling horns stacked into a crown, a marker used almost exclusively for divinity. Many have wings, great feathered forms folded or spread wide. In the hand, not holding the bag, the pine cone-like object reaches toward the sacred tree in a gesture the reliefs repeat obsessively. Palace after palace, rain after rain, tending it, pollinating it, blessing it. No one is entirely certain who these figures are meant to be. The Assyrians had a name for them, and it didn't come from nowhere. The Apkallu, the sages, the watchers. This is where the story gets slippery. To the modern ear, mythology arrives softly, cushioning everything it touches. We hear the Apkallu were mythological sages and file them next to centaurs and unicorns. Safely fictional, safely decorative. But that's not how the Sumerians, or the cultures that inherited their traditions, wrote about them. They weren't recorded like fairy tales. They were recorded like history, like record keeping. Look at what's actually on the clay. The texts name the Apkallu individually, not a vague collective of sages, but specific figures with specific names, listed in order, the way you'd list a line of kings or a chain of custody. The first is called Adapa, or Uana, described arriving in the earliest days of the world before the Great Flood, emerging from the waters to teach humanity. And that word, teach, carries the whole tradition. The Apkallu weren't simply symbols of wisdom. They were credited with delivering, discipline by discipline, writing, mathematics, the measurement of the heavens, city planning, law, agriculture, medicine. Each sage tied to particular knowledge, particular teachings, particular kings they were said to have advised. The records read almost like a bureaucratic ledger of divine consultants. Which sage served which ruler in which city. They ate. That detail alone should give you pause. The texts describe these beings eating, traveling, coming ashore, returning to the water at day's end, appearing before named monarchs and named places, and departing again. That's not the grammar of metaphor. That's the grammar of an eyewitness account, or something copied from one. In deeper Sumerian cosmology, they're tied to the Anunnaki, the great gods said in the oldest texts, to have descended to establish order, divide the world, and set humanity to its labors. The Apkallu were their emissaries, the ones who walked among people and left behind, according to the Mesopotamians themselves, the entire foundation of civilization. Now weigh that against the archaeology, because this is where careful scholars go quiet. The Sumerians really did invent writing, the earliest true script pressed into clay anywhere on Earth. They really did codify some of humanity's first legal systems. They really did master irrigation, sexagesimal mathematics, and the 360-degree division of the circle, tracking planetary movement with an accuracy that still impresses astronomers. None of this is disputed. This is the textbook, mainstream, consensus, cradle of civilization, and everything traced back to where the modern world began runs through this valley. And the people who actually invented all of it didn't take credit for themselves. They pointed at the giants carrying bags and said, "They taught us, this is where it came from." So we're not dealing with fringe history here. And that's exactly the trap worth naming before going further. The moment you hear handbag of the gods, your guard goes up, and it should. The internet has buried this image under the worst kind of speculation, breathless claims about ancient astronauts, lost technology, every unfalsifiable idea imaginable. For most of the 20th century, serious archaeology looked at the bag, watched fringe writers claim it, and made the understandable choice to look away. When wild theorists claim ownership of an object, professionals often abandon it, and the handbag became abandoned ground, noted, described, never seriously examined on its own terms. But here's the distinction the whole story turns on. The fringe claims were bad. The object itself is not. Confusing those two things is exactly the error that let the handbag sit unexamined for 100 years. A ridiculous interpretation doesn't make the underlying artifact ridiculous. Sometime in the late 2000s, a handful of researchers, more curious than cautious, started asking the question no one had properly asked. Forget what it means. Forget gods, forget astronauts, forget the arguments. What is it, physically? What are its dimensions? Where does it appear? And does its distribution behave the way a decorative motif should, or the way something else entirely would? That's a scientific question with nothing to do with belief. You don't need to accept a word about the Anunnaki to measure a carving with calipers and plot it on a map. The team that took this on didn't expect the numbers to say anything remarkable. They expected to find what everyone assumed was there: loose, stylistic variation, a symbol drifting across cultures the way symbols always drift, coincidences of shape that dissolved under scrutiny. They expected, essentially, to close the case. What they found instead kept them up at night. Consider what the work actually involved, because the tedium matters to why the result carries weight. This wasn't a weekend of staring at images and feeling amazed. The team gathered every depiction of the object meeting a strict standard. High enough resolution to measure, documented provenance, dating anchored to something firmer than a hopeful guess. That bar alone eliminated hundreds of internet-famous images that turned out undated, unprovenanced, or outright modern. What survived was a corpus of over 350 carvings, reliefs, seals, and painted figures spanning roughly 3,000 years in multiple continents. Each was digitized, placed against a scale, and measured under an identical protocol. So a bag carved into basalt on one side of the world could be compared number for number against one pressed into clay on the other. And the first thing the numbers did was refuse to scatter. Measure a decorative motif across 3 millennia and you expect noise, not a theory, just how human hands work. A symbol copied across 10 generations of artisans, each learning from the last, each adding or losing a detail, drifts. Proportions wander. A handle grows ornate in one century and vanishes the next. Track a cross, a spiral, a sun disk across even 500 years, and you'll watch it stretch, simplify, and mutate. That drift is the signature of a living symbol. Proof of human beings making choices, expressing culture, decorating for decoration's sake. This handbag didn't drift. Going back through the digitized set, the lead analyst kept landing on the same ratio. Height to width, roughly 1 to 1.2. Not loosely approximate, but tightly consistent, whether the carving predated writing itself or was made 1,000 years later in an Assyrian palace, and whether it came from a culture with no conceivable knowledge of the others. The handle wasn't just present every time. It arced with a consistent curvature and sat at a consistent depth relative to the bag's body. The proportions behaved less like a drawing passed down and embellished, and more like a physical object people were looking at and rendering as faithfully as their medium allowed. Draw a symbol, and you draw the idea of it. Draw an object sitting in front of you, and the real dimensions constrain you. These numbers, the analyst said, looked like the second thing. On the record, he called the feeling of hitting that same ratio across unrelated cultures, frankly, unsettling. An honest account has to pause here, because this is exactly where a story like this can tip into dishonesty. Consistency alone is suggestive, not proof. Ratios can repeat without a shared physical object behind them. Human hands gravitate towards certain proportions, and a rectangle near 1.1.2 is a naturally pleasing shape. Independent artists might land on by chance. Skeptics inside the field raised exactly this objection, and it's a fair one that deserves to stay on the table rather than get waved away. If the ratio were the whole case, the case would be weak. But it wasn't the whole case. It was the thread that pulled the team toward a comparison no one had bothered to run before, because once they had a rigorous measurement protocol for the Mesopotamian bags, they could point the same calipers at cultures on the other side of the planet. That's where this stopped being a curiosity about Sumer and became something much harder to explain. They turned to Mesoamerica, to the Olmec, the region's foundational culture, whose massive carvings predate the Maya by centuries, and to Maya reliefs, where figures of authority hold a small, square-handled object in exactly the same posture. Down at the side, gripped by the handle, carried rather than displayed. When the numbers came back, they didn't merely resemble the Mesopotamian set, they matched it. Same height to width ratio, same handle profile, same relative curvature, same apparent depth. Not a family resemblance. A near identity within the same tolerance you'd expect between two carvings from the same Assyrian workshop. Sit with what that requires. These are cultures separated by an ocean and thousands of years. No accepted trade route connects them. No migration corridor carries Mesopotamian iconography to the jungles of the Yucatan. No shared parent civilization that mainstream history recognizes as passing the motif to both. By every timeline taught in every classroom, the artisans who carved the Olmec bags and the ones who carved the Sumerian bags could never have seen each other's work, shared a teacher, or inherited the image from a common source. And yet, measured the same way, the object comes out the same. There are only a few ways to explain that, and none of them are comfortable. Either it's coincidence on a scale that strains the word, two unrelated cultures independently landing not just on the same ratio, but the same handle geometry, the same depth, the same manner of carrying. Or there was contact history hasn't accounted for. Or both cultures were rendering the same real object, one that genuinely existed in the world of both, which is the possibility that tends to make archaeologists close the folder and change the subject. At least at first, the lead analyst preferred the boring answer. Coincidence happens. Convergent design happens. Humans on opposite sides of the world independently invented pottery, agriculture, pyramids, the bow. It would be lazy to leap to lost civilizations the instant two carvings rhyme. But convergence has its own signature, and it's a loose one. When two cultures independently invent the pyramid, they build very different pyramids. Different angles, different construction, different purpose. Convergence produces the same idea rendered a dozen different ways. What the calipers were showing wasn't the same idea rendered differently. It was the same measurements. And measurements, the team kept concluding, are what you get when everyone is copying the same thing, not the same concept. So they widened the net again, reasoning that if the pattern was real, it shouldn't stop at two hemispheres. It should appear anywhere the record was old enough and detailed enough to catch it, pulling in. Sites with no connection to Sumer or Mesoamerica. Sites that predated writing itself. The object kept turning up, held by a figure, carried by the handle, rendered in that same stubborn shape in places and eras where, by every rule the textbooks enforce, it simply had no business being. At Göbekli Tepe in southern Turkey, carved into pillars that predate Sumer by roughly 6,000 years, predating agriculture, the wheel, pottery, and writing itself, sit three small rectangular shapes along the top of an enclosure. Handles arched, bodies squared, lined up like objects on a shelf, 11,000 years old. Read that twice. It doesn't fit alongside everything else in this story. When those pillars were carved, there was no city anywhere on Earth. There was no Sumer yet to invent this motif and pass it down. And still, the bag is there, thousands of years before the civilization we credit with creating it. Then Bolivia, high on the Altiplano at Tiwanaku, on the great stone doorway known as the Gateway of the Sun, the central figure carries the object again, an ocean and a continent away from every other example. And in early Vedic tradition, in the earliest layers of Hindu temple carving, the same silhouette recurs in the hands of figures who bring knowledge to humankind. Every time, the same manner of carrying. Every time, the same proportions. Every time, a being more than human arriving to teach. Sit with the full shape of it. Turkey, 11,000 years ago. Sumer, 5,000. Mesoamerica, roughly 3,000. The Andes, the Indus tradition. Different continents, different millennia, different gods with different names, and one object, unchanged, carried the same way by all of them. That is not how symbols behave. Symbols drift. Symbols mutate with every retelling. This one refused to. Which brings us to the part of the story itself seems to predict. When the team tried to push the geometry further, to fund a proper cross-continental survey, bring in more labs, test the pattern until it broke or held, doors began quietly closing. Not with shouting, with politeness. One researcher described his own department as politely hostile. No one forbade the work outright. Reasons simply kept surfacing for why it could wait. Budgets stretched elsewhere. Reviewers calling the question interesting before declining to fund it. The work that gets funded tends to be the work that extends a map everyone already agrees on. This threatened the map itself. Here, honesty has to enter the room, because this territory is easy to misuse. Some of that resistance isn't villainy. Some of it is science doing exactly what it should. The oldest, wildest version of this claim, that it proves ancient astronauts, that it proves a lost global empire, was pushed for decades by fringe writers offering no measurements at all, only excitement. It was rightly dismissed. Skepticism earned by bad arguments isn't suppression. It's quality control. A measured study is different in kind, not just in volume, and deserves to be judged on its calipers rather than on the company its subject once kept. But the researchers will tell you that distinction doesn't always get made. The subject arrives pre-poisoned, and caution earned by one fringe claim gets applied to the honest work sitting behind it. The folder closes again, because the cost of opening it is enormous. If this bag is a real single object carried across the ancient world by beings, a dozen cultures, independently called teachers, then either those cultures were connected in ways our current timeline forbids, or something else moved between them. Accepting that doesn't just adjust the human story, it reshapes its opening chapter. So what's actually in the bag? Strip away the wilder answers, and the dimensional analysis still rules out the easy ones. It isn't a water vessel. The proportions are wrong for holding liquid, too shallow, too square. The handle positioned for lifting something rigid rather than something heavy and sloshing. Some argue it's a tool or instrument, Mike Treese, fitting for beings whose entire mythic role is delivering skills. And note that the same figures often wear a small banded device on the wrist that later cultures had no obvious reason to invent independently. And then there's the answer. Researchers whisper more than publish. Recall the me, the divine ordinance is Mesopotamian. Myth describes as physical objects, things that could be carried, stored, stolen, and moved from one city to another. Kingship, writing, law, knowledge. Itself imagined as things you could hold in your hands. A container for knowledge, carried by the beings said to have brought knowledge, appearing wherever knowledge inexplicably showed up. No one can prove that's what the bag is. That's the honest ending. The geometry is real. The distribution is real. The consistency is genuinely unsettling. The meaning is still buried. Calipers can tell you the object is the same across 11,000 years and 4 continents. They can't yet tell you what it was, how the image traveled, or whether it traveled at all, rather than describing something each of these cultures independently saw with their own eyes. The pattern is broken wide open. The answer is still in the ground. No. But here's where it's worth handing it over to you. The measurements aren't in dispute. Roughly 1 to 1.2, the same handle arc, the same depth, carried the same way by gods with different names for 11,000 years. That much is on the stone. The only open question is what the stone is telling us. So, coincidence on a scale we've never documented before? Contact between civilizations our history refuses to acknowledge? Or one real object, carried by real beings, remembered the same way by everyone who ever saw it? Drop your take in the comments and tell me which explanation you can't quite settle on. And if this one rearranged something in your head, subscribe. Because the next thing they filed away and hoped we'd stop asking about is already sitting on the table.